Well, we know Mr. Trump's views about trade. He believes that trade is a win-lose game. This is wrong. Trade is not a win-lose game. Trade is a win-win game provided proper conditions are met. And the reason why the US have a huge trade deficit is not because other countries are cheating the US, and they should redress this. The reason why the US has such a large trade deficit is because US people overconsume and undersave. This is a macroeconomic issue. The US economy is doing well, is growing well, it's competitive. The distribution of the growth in the US has something wrong. Rich people get too much, poor people don't get enough. Middle-class people believe they are threatened, and this is probably why he is very probably, the next president of the United States of America, not because of the US trade deficit. Trend towards protectionism is a US trend. Most other countries are not leaning towards protectionism. It's true that there are new preoccupations in many countries, for instance, about national security. This is understandable as geopolitical tension, power rivalry, like the huge wars which we have in the Middle East, are developments that lead to a more conflicting, more fragmented world, and some countries fear for their national security and hence believe that they should be less trade dependent than in the past. This is understandable, but the only place where this has become a dominant feature is the US, and I wish that others, like my European compatriots or the Chinese people, keep the view that trade opening is the way to go and that we should do that under a system that properly administers the rules of trade so that the win-win part of trade dominates. I think EU and China share a common belief that opening trade is the way to go. Now, China may have good reasons to have a national security preoccupation. We now in Europe have a good reason to have a European security preoccupation given what's happening in Ukraine. This should not lead to overhauling the view we have that trade opening is the way to go. We may have to take some precautions here and there. We may make sure that we are not overly vulnerable if conflicts would arise. But overall, I do not think neither EU nor China should change their view that international division of labor is good for growth and notably for many other developing countries who are still expecting to export their way in order to grow. I mean, these numbers are average numbers, and if you look at the French part of the Chinese market, or the German part of the Chinese market, or the Italian part of the Chinese market, they are not average. The French have comparative advantages in the luxury industry, for instance. The Germans may have a comparative advantage in the car industry, and the Italians may have a comparative advantage in the wine industry. That's all fine. The issue for China is whether, A, its economic growth will resume at a level which is the one we've known in recent decades, and there is a question mark about this, given the over-saving and under-consumption of Chinese households, and second, whether China will remain open to the rest of the world. I mean, this is a good example of the benefits of the World Trade Organization. We have rules in the WTO that address the problem of trade distorting subsidies. We Europeans believe that the level of subsidization of car production in China leads to an unfair comparative advantage on the European market as compared to European EVs. WTO rules allow us to offset this unfair comparative advantage with duties. These are the rules of WTO, provided, of course, these duties are properly calculated. Now, China, on its side, believes, no, the EU is wrong, we do not over-subsidize, and your numbers and your duties are not right according to the rules of WTO. So what? We take our measures. China goes to WTO and says, I want to dispute the EU interpretation of the WTO rules. I need the judge to make an adjudication. A judge will make an adjudication whether or not the EU are right in offsetting what they believe are excess subsidies with duties. This is a dispute. This is not a war. This is a dispute, like something we may have between you and me. We may disagree on something without trying to kill each other. So that's where we are now. The main question behind this one is, should EU and China properly strategize in order to grow the electric part of mobility? Given our environmental ambitions, I think the answer is yes. We should, for instance, favor Chinese investment in Europe the way Chinese favored European investment in the past. The equation is the other way around now. We had a lead advantage at the time. China wanted to benefit from it. It's now time for China to do the same in Europe, and for the Europeans to say, welcome. WTO has changed recently because the US do not care anymore about WTO and the disciplines they had subscribed, which is a problem because you have one big elephant in international trade that is basically disputing the rules of the game, and that is going protectionist unilaterally in its own way. That's the first change. The second change is that the world has changed. We are trying together to cope with global warming, with biodiversity loss, so environmental issues have stepped in much more vigorously than in the past. Trade and economic life is digitalizing. We have to adjust the rules of WTO to this new world environment. We may have to, for instance, give a clearer interpretation of what national security means. You probably cannot do anything trade-wise in the name of national security. So these are areas where we need to update the rule books of WTO. The question is, can we do that without the US? Maybe, and that's an option which I think we seriously need to consider. When I say we, is those who believe we should remain together in a rules-based open trade system. Well, the world never was flat. That was an oversimplification. It was more open, yes, and that's a good thing. But it was not open the same way for everybody, and rightly so, because notably poorer countries may not have the capacity to compete, whereas industrialized countries like China, for instance, have this capacity now. So the world never was flat. What we had at the time was a rapid globalization. What we have now is not a de-globalization. Volumes of world trade in goods and services are still growing. We have a slower globalization than in the past, and trade flows may not flow the same way as they did 20 or 30 years ago. They still grow, which means that we still need a lot of trade to grow our economies, and notably for those of these economies who need to grow more than others, and these are the poorest countries. I think, first, I've never been optimistic or pessimistic. I'm rather activistic. I'm trying to move things in the direction which I believe is the right one. Second, it's clear for me that a world which is more conflicted, more fragmented, will be an economically less efficient world. I believe this will lead to overall slower growth, slower wealth and good life for people, hence more social and political tensions, hence more risks for conflicts. So this chain of causalities is worrying, and I do not believe that if this world is more fragmented, people will be more happy.